Our second scripture lesson today comes from the book of Matthew, chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. It goes like this. Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by men. I tell you the truth. They have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the street corners, to be seen by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep babbling on like the pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask it of him. Please pray with me. Dear God, may these words not be babble, but may they draw our hearts all closer to you. Amen. Well, the year was 1989, and the principal of Nathan Bishop Middle School in Providence, Rhode Island, asked a local rabbi to pray a prayer during their graduation ceremony. Now, this was standard procedure in that Rhode Island school system. At both the middle school and the high school graduations, a rather generic prayer was traditionally offered by one of the religious leaders in the community. Normally, the presence of this prayer was not questioned. However, on this occasion, one family, themselves Jewish, objected. They saw this public prayer as a violation of the separation between church and state. In protest, they requested a temporary restraining order to bar the rabbi from speaking. When the court denied their request, the objecting family did attend the graduation, but they also continued their litigation, where the case finally ended up in the United States Supreme Court in 1992. Well, the Supreme Court, as well as Christians everywhere, were divided on how to define a generic prayer given by religious authority at a graduation ceremony. Because it was at a public school graduation, was the prayer simply a tradition that was voluntary in its participation? Or was the prayer an example of the state establishing the practice of religion in violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution? The surprising majority opinion in the case was that a school-directed prayer at a public graduation ceremony was in violation of the Constitution of the United States. The court ruled that because the state money funded the school, the state had no business promoting religion of any kind, even a simple generic blessing at a graduation ceremony. The practical implications of this ruling was that public prayer was eliminated from public school graduation ceremonies across the nation. But the other effect of this ruling was also another step in our culture in the hearts and minds of the American people. It further and again underscored the generally held belief that one's religion was an entirely private matter, and that as such, it was not proper to share that religion in the public sphere. You see, today's sermon is about whether the practice of our faith should be public or it should be private. And And within the United States, the thinking about this and about how appropriate it is for a person to publicly demonstrate their faith, it is, I believe, somewhat clouded by our commitment to the Constitution and its separation of church and state clauses. A simple Google search about public faith will bring up lots of articles about this establishment clause in the Constitution. In common American jargon, we talk about a wall of separation between the church and the state. We talk about public and private spheres where religion can be practiced in the private sphere and cannot be practiced in the public sphere. But whenever these two spheres touch, wherever that wall is broken down on these issues, Christians of all different types agree and disagree. Some Christians believe in prayer in public schools, and other Christians do not. Some believe that only private personal prayers should be allowed in publicly funded places, while other people believe that a simple generic prayer at a public school ceremony or at a sporting event is perfectly okay. But while all these metaphors of walls and spheres and separations are useful for us to delineate what can be done by the government regarding the taxpayers' funding of religion, I would argue that all of those categories are not helpful for a Christian trying to figure out how they should live into the public and the private practice of their faith. These categories of public or private spheres, which are actually only the categories for government-funded activities, those ideas have found their way from the public into common Christian thinking. And because of that, the practice of Christianity in public has been rather neutralized. N.T. Wright, in his book Simply Christian, puts it this way. He says, "We will arrange for religion to become a small sub-department of ordinary life. It will be quite safe, harmless in fact, with church life carefully separated off from everything else in the world, whether politics, art, sex, economics, or whatever. Those who want it can have enough of it to keep them going. Those who don't want their life and their way of life disrupted by anything religious can live as if though the rumor of God had never existed. We are, after all, in charge of our own fate. We are the captains of our own souls, whatever that might be. That is the philosophy which has dominated our culture. From this point of view, spirituality is like a private hobby, an upmarket version of daydreaming for those who like that kind of thing. With all of the public presence removed from Christianity, the faith of our fathers and mothers has often been reduced from a force for change in this world to just be a private hobby that we feed once a week on Sundays with bits of scripture and music, just like we are sprinkling spiritual fish food on our souls. Instead of Christianity making a difference and becoming the sole and driving purpose to our lives, instead of it making a change in our worlds, Christianity becomes something that we ignore, unless it is convenient, unless it fits into our schedules. My friends, this sort of a private faith is not biblical Christianity. This is not the faith which led thousands of first-century Christians to become martyrs for the public practice of their faith. Our first scripture passage today from James 2 says it best. Our faith without works is dead. While faith must begin in our own personal hearts and minds, our faith cannot simply stay there, or it is not true faith. For when you truly understand and believe in God's love for you and for everyone else in the world, that is the sort of faith that motivates you to action. A faith that is simply believed and not lived is not a faith worth having. It's like a dried up plant that's simply taking up space. something that isn't useful to anyone. Your faith, when truly put into action, should matter to others. Whether it is for kids in their Sunday school class looking up to you as their leader, or perhaps to a lonely senior who appreciates your visit or phone call. Whether it is the blessing of your voice raised in song, or your expertise in calm and sound judgment when working on a project or a committee. If you're not practicing your faith in some sort of public manner, you may call it faith, but it isn't the Christian faith. Now at this point, you may be wondering about our second scripture lesson today, from Matthew 6. Many people point to this scripture when they want to advocate against praying out loud or practicing your faith in public. But typically they don't read the entire passage. Matthew 6 is not actually warning against practicing your faith publicly. Matthew 6 is warning against your motivations for that very public practice. A person whose motivations for their public actions of faith to simply feed their own ego or to build up their own pyramids of power has, according to Matthew 6, already received their reward in human acclaim. The people who remind me of this are the televangelists, those who can't seem to get enough attention or money to fill that empty hole in their souls. This is not describing the faith of a person who dedicates their life to the least of these, a person who lives out their faith in public. In 1933, the Great Depression in the United States was in full force. Many people were without jobs. They were without food. They were without hope. It was a terrible, desperate time. In the midst of this poverty in New York City, Dorothy Day and her friend Peter Morin began to write a little newspaper. They called it The Catholic Worker, and she sold it in Union Square for a penny a copy. The newspaper was firmly grounded in the God-given dignity of every human person, and it encouraged people to nonviolence, to voluntary poverty, to prayer, and to hospitality for the homeless, the exiled, the hungry, and the forsaken. The newspaper began in May, but just encouraging other people to do these things through their faith was not enough. Dorothy wrote in her autobiography, "I could write, I could protest to arouse the conscience, but where was the Catholic leadership in the gathering of bands of men and women together for the actual works of mercy?" Convicted by her own words and her own call to action, by that fall, Dorothy and her husband were housing homeless people in their own home. By the next year, they had raised enough funding and interest to create their first self-supporting community. In their communal home, everyone committed to the personal obligation to care for the physical and the spiritual needs of everyone else in that home. It became known as a house of hospitality, a place for the immediate relief of anyone in need of a roof over their head, food in their stomach, and a bed to sleep in. The Catholic worker movement did not stop with just one community. They founded other communities across the country and across the world, and they're still growing today. Today, there are 245 Catholic worker communities located all around the world. And the income for these communities comes from donations, their own cottage industries, and from the outside jobs of people who choose to live there in the community. There are also volunteers, people who don't live there, but who are committed to the cause of eliminating poverty and homelessness in their communities. And they frequently give of their time and resources to these intentional communities. Within the communities, everyone treats each other as if though they were angels in disguise. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of people have been helped by the vision and the work that was started by one woman who decided to stand up against the oppression of poverty and homelessness. A person who decided not to keep her spirituality private, but to actually live out her faith with her light in the world. So, in conclusion, while many Americans talk about the separation of church and state and the standard that public tax money should not go toward the practice of any particular religion, this is not a call for your faith to be simply your own personal and private hobby, because a faith without public works is a dead faith. And the ultimate example for us as Christians as to how to live out our life of faith, for that we must look to and emulate Jesus. Remember, Jesus did not live a life of personal piety alone on a mountaintop, with people coming and talking to him about spiritual things as a guru, seeking inspiration from him. Instead, Jesus lived his life, his public life of love, out among the people. He lived his life of love as a call to action, caring for the sick and the least of these. In the same way, too, our faith cannot be something that we do simply for an hour or two on Sunday morning. A faith that is worth believing in is a faith that is lived out in public in a way that makes a difference, that changes the lives of others in your community, as well as changing your own life too. So be it. Amen.